When I introduced the concept of life histories and life history trade-offs a few lectures ago, I pointed out that organisms can allocate the resources available to them in different ways in order to maximize reproductive success. Now, in that discussion, I illustrated the idea of life history trade-offs by comparing life histories among different species. But different individuals in a population of the same species also might allocate resources in different ways to maximize their individual reproductive success. For example, in a species of lizard called the side-blotched lizard that's been studied for many years by Barry Sonervo, individual females in the population may vary greatly in the number of eggs they lay in a single reproductive event, what we would refer to as in a single clutch. Some females may lay as few as just 2 eggs in a clutch, whereas other females might lay as many as 9 eggs in a clutch. Now, there's a life history trade-off operating here as well. Females that lay fewer eggs lay larger eggs, while females that lay more eggs in a clutch will lay smaller eggs. The reason for this trade-off is that an individual female only has a certain amount of resource that it can put into any single reproductive event. But an individual female can allocate that resource in different ways, producing a lot of small eggs or a few large eggs. Now, you might think that a female should always make more eggs, right? Then she'll have more offspring. But it turns out that small eggs will hatch into small offspring. And those small offspring, because they're small, will be less likely to survive. So the trade-off here really is a trade-off between producing a few high-quality offspring or many low-quality offspring. Now, the reason I've brought up this additional example of a life history trade-off is because it illustrates that individuals in a population can change aspects of their behavior in a flexible way in order to maximize their individual reproductive success by allocating the resources available to them. We've talked about animal behavior already at the very end of the middle third of our course, which centered on the theme of development and homeostasis. And I argued at that time that an animal's behavior can be viewed as a kind of homeostatic adaptation, allowing an individual to maintain what's essentially a favorable environment, a favorable external environment. In today's lecture, we're going to go back to the topic of animal behavior, but from the perspective of resources and population ecology. Now, as animals interact with other individuals in their population, they sometimes appear to make relatively sophisticated choices. I put that in quotes. But choices in their behavior, such as choices about which other individuals they interact with, or how they interact with those individuals. These flexible behavioral responses help individuals in a population maximize their own reproductive success in general by helping them maximize their ability to acquire and allocate resources. And I should add here that in the context of a population of organisms, the resources that are relevant to this to an individual include not only things like the food it may eat or the space it may use, such as we've already considered in this third section of the course, but it also may include other individuals in that population which serve as resources themselves. For example, individuals that might serve as mates, which is a kind of resource an individual needs. The field of biology that integrates the study of the behavior of organisms with the ecological and evolutionary consequences of those behaviors on the population level is what we call behavioral ecology. And that's what we're going to be discussing in this lecture and in the next. Well, how an individual in a population behaves obviously can have a major influence on the survival and reproduction of that individual relative to other individuals in the population. Behavioral biologists or behavioral ecologists, I should say, who are interested in ecological and evolutionary significance, the ecological and evolutionary significance of different behavioral strategies, different ways that an individual might behave, analyze the effects of different behaviors on the survival and reproductive success of an individual in terms of what we refer to as the costs and benefits of those behaviors. This idea really is just an extension of the point we've been making all along, that energy and resources generally are limiting, and that these limitations affect living systems at all levels of organization. An individual only has a limited amount of resource it can devote to different kinds of the behaviors it can perform, and spending these resources represents a cost. A particular behavior might be costly for an individual to perform, but there also may be some benefit associated with performing that behavior. So whether or not an individual will perform a behavior in one way or another will depend, in general, we would expect, on the relative benefits and costs of that behavior. If the benefits are greater than the costs, then that behavior would be favorable, and we would expect the organism to do that. Now, the costs associated with behavior can be much more complex, or in some cases more subtle, than simply expending the energy that, or other materials that the animal needs to use to perform that behavior. Let me explain what I mean by that by defining costs a little bit more specifically. Behavioral ecologists typically separate the costs of behaviors into three broad categories. We refer to energetic costs, which have to do with the amount of energy, or perhaps other resources, that are expended in performing the behavior. Now, these costs are paid in terms that we've been talking about all along in this third of the course. They're paid in terms of energy and resources. We call them energetic costs in general. There's also a category of costs that we refer to as risk costs. Now, risk costs have to do with the increased chance that an individual involved in some behavior is injured or killed as a result of performing that behavior. Now, this cost is obviously paid in a different currency than what we've seen so far. Essentially, this cost is paid in terms of changing the effective mortality rate of an individual. Finally, the last category of costs we would refer to are what we call opportunity costs. Opportunity costs refer to the loss of opportunities that would accrue to accrue benefits from performing other behaviors because a certain behavior is performed instead. An animal can't do two things at once. It can do either this thing or that thing. If it chooses to do one thing, then it may suffer an opportunity cost because it's unable to do something else. Now, this is all pretty general. Let me illustrate these different kinds of costs with an example. And the example I want to use is the example of territorial behavior, say in a population of song sparrows. We'll use song sparrows because we talked about them last lecture, you remember, in the context of an island population that fluctuated in its population size. Actually, song sparrows are very common birds occurring throughout North America. They live in hedgerows around fields. They're very a common bird that you would find in a suburban garden, for example. As is the case for many species of birds, and in fact for many kinds of animals in general, male song sparrows defend territories from which they exclude other males. A territory is a valuable resource. It's a valuable resource because the male will use that territory to attract a female, and then the male and the female will build their nest on that territory, raise their young in that territory, and in many cases obtain all the resources they need to accomplish their reproduction from the space available in that territory. So it behooves a male to keep other males out of that territory, to defend that space. Now, to defend a territory, a male song sparrow or other bird will typically patrol around the perimeter of that territory all day long. It'll be going around the edge. It'll periodically stop at the edge, and it will sing. Song, in this case, is used as a keep-out signal to other males. It's a broadcast signal telling other males, this space is occupied, this is mine, and you shouldn't come here. Now, if a territorial male bird sees another male of its species intruding, then it'll chase that male. It'll chase it off its territory. And in fact, if the intruding male doesn't leave readily, then the territorial male may actually attack the intruder. They'll actually get into a fight. You can find sparrows on the ground wrestling around, grappling at each other, pecking at each other. So it's pretty serious business, this territorial fence. There's a lot that goes into it. It's a whole suite of behaviors designed to defend some space that represents resources for the males. Now let's ask what the costs of territory defense are. And we'll do this in terms of, say, a song sparrow defending a territory. There's an energetic cost to this behavior, obviously. It takes energy. Literally, it takes ATP for a male to fly around, to patrol its territory, to spend the effort it takes to get around to different parts of the territory or to chase other males. The energy that the male uses for these activities, clearly it can't be used for other aspects of its life history. And so the expenditure of this energy represents a kind of energetic cost. There's also a risk cost associated with territorial behavior. The risk cost comes from the fact that the male may become injured if it gets into a fight. In fact, it might even be killed in some cases. In either case, by patrolling its territory, by defending its territory, by trying to keep other males out, it may incur some injury, and this injury represents a risk cost to the male. Now, risk costs are quite different from energetic costs. It's independent of the energy the animal is spending to defend its territory. It's simply a change in the possibility that it might die, its mortality rate as a result of this behavior. Finally, there are opportunity costs associated with territorial behavior. When a male is patrolling his territory or chasing out other males, it can't do other important things it might need to do. For example, it can't spend that time feeding to acquire more resources. It can't spend that time searching for where its female might be, mate guarding that female. The female might be off someplace associating with another male surreptitiously. The male wants to know about that, and if he doesn't follow the female, there's an opportunity cost that may be associated with the loss of some paternity from the female's reproductive effort. So, in a sense, opportunity cost in this sense, opportunity costs really involve a kind of time resource. As I said, animals can't do two things simultaneously. And so if they're involved in one kind of behavior, then there may be an opportunity cost associated with the fact that they can't simultaneously do something else that's important to them. Well, so the kinds of costs we have to keep track of when we're considering behavior add a number of dimensions that are different from a simple analysis of cost in terms of energy and resources. Now, what about the benefits associated with performing some behavior in general? I started this discussion by telling you that an animal should behave in a particular way, or perform a particular behavior, I might say, if the benefits of doing so outweigh the costs. So we want to ask, how do we measure benefits of performing behaviors? Well, in this sense, or in this case, we're actually on more familiar ground. The benefits of behavior need to be calculated ultimately in terms we've seen in our discussion of evolution in the first third of the course. Specifically, these benefits must involve increasing either the survival of an individual or, even more importantly, the reproductive success of an individual. Another way to think of this is that the benefits associated with behavior can be measured in terms of life history attributes, such as survivorship or fecundity. Now, the point of this discussion about the costs and benefits associated with behavior is that by understanding the costs and benefits of behavior, we gain insight into how an individual responds flexibly to the circumstances in which it finds itself. In other words, as the costs or benefits associated with some behavior change, as they shift because of some change in the environment, then what we might expect to see are different behavioral strategies corresponding to these different circumstances that the organism, that the individual finds itself in. This is analogous in a sense to the way a female side-blotched lizard might actually produce fewer large eggs or a greater number of small eggs. There may be some circumstances in which it's better to have just a few really good young that will be very likely to survive. There may be other ecological circumstances where it's better to produce more young, even if those young are less likely to survive. So too, there may be circumstances an animal finds itself in where performing one behavior is more advantageous than performing a different behavior because of changes in the circumstances it finds itself, changes that have to do ultimately with the resources available to it. Now, I should point out here that even if we understand in general terms what the costs and benefits of behavior are, measuring these costs of behavior and benefits of behavior really in the real world is very difficult, potentially. You can imagine, for example, in theory, that we might want to measure the energetic costs of our male song sparrow patrolling its territory. How much does that cost? We'd like to get a number for that. Well, we can measure how much energy an organism is actually expending, for example, by measuring the amount of oxygen it consumes or the amount of CO2 it produces. Remember, those are input and output substances from cellular respiration, and so they correspond to the amount of ATP that's being generated. But how are we going to do that with a bird defending its territory in the field? How are we going to measure these things in a wild animal out in nature? Well, these kinds of difficulties are what behavioral ecologists overcome in very clever ways to measure things that are associated with or correlated more directly with specific costs and benefits. And in this way, ways that behavioral ecologists can get indirect measures or related measures of costs and benefits. I want to give you a couple of examples that illustrate that point. The first example concerns territorial behavior as well. And in this case, we're going to look at the territorial behavior. We're going to consider the territorial behavior of a species of Hawaiian bird called a honeycreeper. Actually, the Hawaiian name for this bird is the iiwi. But we're just going to call it the honeycreeper because my Hawaiian is a little rusty. Now, honeycreepers are like hummingbirds in general. They're specialized for feeding on the nectar that's produced by flowers. This nectar is a primary source of energy for them. And furthermore, they defend territories that include the flowers from which they obtain this nectar. Now, our discussion of costs and benefits would suggest that an individual should only exhibit territorial behavior if the benefits of having a territory outweigh the costs of defending that territory. In the case of a nectarivorous bird like a honeycreeper or a hummingbird, the benefit to holding a territory can be measured relatively specifically in the amount of nectar it can obtain from the flowers on that territory. In other words, we can simplify our problem by saying we're pretty sure that that's the benefit of having this territory. And we can measure that benefit by actually counting the number of flowers or maybe even directly measuring the amount of nectar produced in different flowers. Now, in this case, what we predict is that individuals would only defend a territory if it holds a sufficient number of flowers to provide the food it needs to at least offset the costs of territorial defense. Now, we may not know exactly what the cost of territorial defense is, but we can make a more general prediction, and that is that there should be two thresholds. There should be a density of flowers that's so low that a territory would have too sparse a distribution of flowers for any honeycreeper to be able to obtain enough nectar to make it worth its while to defend that territory. On the other hand, we would also expect that there might be an upper threshold where the density of flowers in an area is so high that an individual doesn't have to bother to defend a territory. It only needs to bother to defend a territory if it needs exclusive access to those resources so it gets enough. So if there's not enough resource to possibly make it worthwhile to defend a territory, or if there's so much resource that there's no point in defending a territory, in those two cases we wouldn't expect these honeycreepers to be territorial. Only at some intermediate value of the numbers of flowers per the unit area that the animal can defend would we expect to see territorial defense. And in fact, this is exactly the pattern that's observed. If you look at individuals living in different areas that have different density of flowers, you find that individuals only defend territories at some intermediate range of flower densities. As flower density goes down below some threshold, territorial behavior ceases. As it goes up above some threshold, again, territorial behavior ceases. So this kind of evidence suggests that there really is a relationship between the benefits of performing a behavior, in this case territoriality, and the costs associated with that. And that the animal is essentially, not consciously, but effectively making some decision as to whether to be territorial or not, depending on this benefit to cost ratio. Now, let's look at a second example, which is a little bit more complicated, or I should say a little bit less direct, an example of how behavioral ecologists might infer the relationship between costs and benefits associated with some behavior. In this case, we're going to look at the nesting behavior of a species of bird, of warbler that is called the prothonotary warbler. Now, let me give you a little background about bird nesting in general before we talk about this example. Normally, you would expect the eggs that you find in a bird's nest to be laid by the female that actually built that nest, right? But it turns out that in some cases, there are some species that we call brood parasites, where the females don't actually build their own nest. What they do is they find the nests of other species and they lay their eggs in those nests. That's why they're called brood parasites. They parasitize the broods of other species. Now, in North America, a very common brood parasite is the brown-headed cowbird. And the brown-headed cowbird will lay its eggs in the nests of very many different kinds of species, including the prothonotary warbler. Now, there are two more facts you need to know. First, for many species of parasitized birds like this warbler, the bird that's parasitized is unable to remove the egg of the parasite from its nest. It may be able to recognize that egg, but it can't do anything about it. I mean, its beak isn't large enough to get around that egg and to toss it out. So if an individual female is parasitized, it essentially has to make a decision. What should it do? Should it keep incubating the eggs in this nest that it's built, even though at least one of those eggs is from a completely different species? Or should it abandon that nest altogether and just start over? Now, why would it need to make this decision? Well, obviously, because there's a cost associated with being parasitized. The cowbird egg in that nest will be an individual that takes resources from that female. She isn't going to be able to prevent that individual from getting resources, the food she brings to the nest. And in fact, cowbirds in general grow much faster than the species they parasitize. So the cowbird nestling will become much bigger, and in fact will take more than a lion's share of the resources brought to the nest. So there's a cost in terms of the growth rate and even the mortality of the individuals who are actually born in that nest, the young that belong there. Of course, there's also a cost with going off and building a new nest. It takes time and effort and energy in order to go and start a new nest over. So which is greater? Which is a greater cost? Building a new nest or incubating a nest that has a parasite's egg in it? Well, the answer to this question is it depends. It depends on the resources available to the female. And specifically, it depends on a particular resource, which is the availability of other suitable nest sites. You see, the prothonotary warbler has to build its nests inside cavities, natural cavities found in trees. The prothonotary warbler can't build its own cavity. It has to find some hole that's already there, a hole that was built by some other species that might have drilled a hole in that tree. Prothonotary warbler territories will vary in terms of how many potential nest sites you find in that territory. Some territories will have a lot of nest sites, and some territories will have few nest sites. Nest sites in this sense, then, are a kind of resource. So what does the female prothonotary warbler do if her nest is parasitized? It depends on how many other suitable nest sites she has in her territory. If she's on a territory that has a lot of suitable nest sites, then she will abandon the nest that's been parasitized and start over. On the other hand, if she's on a territory where there are not suitable other nest sites, or very few of them, then she will maintain that nest that she started and suffer the cost of parasitism. So this is an example where we don't know exactly what the costs are. We can't put specific numbers on that, but on these things. But we can show that the relative costs vary with the resources that are available to the individual. All right. The examples we've just looked at show how behavior involves adaptations for maximizing the use of resources to increase reproductive success of individuals in response to resource availability in an environment. Now, probably the most important feature of an organism's environment, which it must respond to, is the other individuals in its population, the other individuals of its species with which it's associated. In general, the interactions among individuals of the same species of a population are referred to what we would call the social behavior of that species. And to a first approximation, we might ask simply, how social are individuals going to be with each other? Are individuals in a population of a particular species going to associate a lot with each other or not very much with each other? In some cases, they do associate a lot with each other, living close together, interacting quite a bit. In other cases, they don't, such as in a dispersed territorial bird. How can we estimate whether a species will show this kind of close social association or group living or not? Again, we can do so to a first approximation by thinking of the costs and benefits associated with this particular kind of behavior, group living or social behavior. Well, let's consider just briefly the kind of benefits we might associate with group living, or the kind of benefits that an individual might accrue by living with a group of other individuals of its same species. Social behavior may allow an individual to actually gain more resources. For example, social hunting animals like African wild dogs are able to capture larger prey or capture prey more efficiently by living in a social group. A single wild dog can't take down many of the animals that this carnivorous species would prey on. But a group of wild dogs working together can do so. So one obvious benefit of living in a group is the ability to acquire more resources than an individual could on its own. Social behavior also may reduce the risk of predation of an individual in the group. Now, there are many examples that demonstrate this. I briefly just want to give you one example, and this involves the benefit that a bird might have from being in a flock of other birds as opposed to being on its own. a bird in a flock is less likely to suffer predation in general. This has been demonstrated actually in a very clever experiment done by a behavioral ecologist named Robert Kenward, who used a trained hawk to attack groups of pigeons in the wild. So Kenward would take his hawk and he would fly it at groups of pigeons, and he'd ask how likely was the hawk to catch a pigeon in the group. Well, what Kenward found is that it depended on the size of the group. If pigeons were in a small group or on their own, the likelihood that the hawk would catch one was relatively high. But as the group size increased, the likelihood that the hawk would catch any one pigeon in that is relatively low. Now, you might think that's counterintuitive. You'd think if there are more pigeons around, why shouldn't it be easier for the hawk to catch one? Well, the reason is that individuals living in a group benefit from being in that group in a way that makes them hard to catch by predators in a number of ways. For example, it's hard for a hawk to fly through a flock of pigeons. It might actually hurt itself by bumping into some pigeon when it's going after another pigeon. It's harder for a predator to follow one individual in a group because there are too many other individuals around to distract it. Or furthermore, it's possible that the individuals in the group are able to detect the predator sooner than if they're not in a group. Why? Because there's simply more eyes and ears on the lookout for predators. It turns out this is probably what was the case in Kenward's data for the relationship between group size and the success of hawk attacks. What Kenward was also able to show is that the distance at which the individuals in a flock of pigeons detected the predator increased, became a larger distance as the size of the group increased. There were more eyes looking for hawks, and they would see a hawk at a greater distance. And of course, because the group detected the predator at a greater distance, it had more time to take evasive action, to go on the ground, to get into cover, and make it impossible for that predator to take any one of those individuals. Well, there are obviously also costs associated with group living, and I won't give you any specific examples here, but I'll just mention some of the obvious costs that an individual might incur by living in a group. One almost universal cost of living in a group is that an individual in a group has a higher likelihood of being exposed to disease or to parasites. Now, why should this be? Well, it's simply because there's more contact between individuals of the same species. And so disease organisms or parasites that are specialized for infecting a particular species or feeding on a particular species will just run into the right stuff sooner. They'll bump into each other. So there's a cost in terms of exposure to disease and parasites. There are other potential costs of group living as well. For example, although a group might detect predators more quickly, as we saw with the example of the hawk attacking pigeon flocks, it's also true that a group is more conspicuous. A predator might detect a group more easily because the group is bigger. It just makes more noise. It's more obvious. There also may be increased competition for resources in a group. We saw this before when we talked about dispersal patterns, spacing patterns in populations. If individuals are clumped in a population, they essentially come into competition with each other more quickly or more greatly for any particular resource they might be interested in utilizing. There are actually some other interesting consequences of living in a group that have negative impacts on the individuals in that group. One interesting one is that by living in a group, an individual increases the likelihood that its mate will copulate with some other individual. In other words, we often find in social living animals that there are many what we would call extra-pair copulations or extra-pair fertilizations. So the social mate of a particular individual may actually be on the side mating with some other individual. This happens more in larger groups than in species that are dispersed and living more solitarily. Well, we've seen in this lecture how animals can behave differently under different circumstances depending on the costs and benefits associated with particular behaviors. Specifically, animals appear to change their behavior in a way that maximizes the difference between benefits accrued and costs incurred. Even the occurrence of something that might be very complex, such as social behavior, appears to be something we can think about in terms of costs and benefits. Ultimately, these costs and benefits have to do with the resources available in a population. In these cases, costs and benefits can be thought of in some cases, I should say, costs and benefits can be thought of in terms of the kinds of energy and resources we've been talking about throughout this third of the course. In other cases, however, the costs and benefits of behavior are measured in more complex terms, such as the probability of being able to find a nest site, as that was the case of our prothonotary warbler example. Ultimately, the benefit of any behavior has to boil down to some measure of reproductive success. And this particular point, that behavior benefits individuals by increasing their reproductive success, leads to a particularly interesting twist, which has to do with the fact that in a population, individuals are related to each other to different degrees. And the fact that they are related to each other in different degrees matters when it comes to how individuals interact with each other. And that's the point we'll begin with in the next lecture.